The hunger that never left Audrey Hepburn. How war trauma created Hollywood's most elegant tragedy. April 12, 1953. Audrey Hepburn stood in front of her dressing room mirror at Paramount Studios, preparing for another scene in Roman Holiday, the film that would make her a star. She was 24 years old, stunningly beautiful, and about to become the most beloved actress of her generation. But as she stared at her reflection, all Audrey could see was the starving Dutch girl who had eaten tulip bulbs to survive during World War II. The trauma of those hunger years had carved itself so deep into her soul that no amount of fame, success, or adoration could fill the emptiness inside. What happened to Audrey during the war would shape every day of her seemingly perfect life, turning Hollywood's most elegant star into its most tortured soul. This is the Audrey Hepburn story that shatters every beautiful illusion. Not the graceful princess from Roman Holiday or the sophisticated icon from Breakfast at Tiffany's. This is about the starving child who never truly escaped the war, the perfectionist who was slowly killing herself to maintain an impossible image, and the woman who spent her entire life trying to feed a hunger that food could never satisfy. Because behind every elegant pose, every perfect outfit, every radiant smile, Audrey Hepburn was fighting a battle that began in Nazi-occupied Holland and never truly ended. She was Hollywood's most beautiful victim of war trauma, and nobody, not even those closest to her, fully understood the depth of her suffering. The Audrey Hepburn the world fell in love with was born from starvation, terror, and a child's desperate need to disappear. Audrey Kathleen Rustin was born in Brussels in 1929, but her early childhood was spent in England and the Netherlands. When World War II erupted, 10-year-old Audrey was living with her mother, Baroness Ella van Heemstra, in the Dutch town of Arnhem, a location that would become one of the most devastating battlegrounds of the war. What happened to Audrey during the 5-year Nazi occupation would traumatize her so profoundly that she would never speak openly about it. Even decades later, when she was one of the most famous women in the world, the first trauma was abandonment. Audrey's father, Joseph Anthony Rustin, was a British-Austrian businessman with Nazi sympathies who left his family when the war began. For a sensitive child, her father's abandonment felt like a personal rejection, the first lesson that love could disappear without warning. But the physical horror of the occupation was far worse than emotional abandonment. By 1944, the hunger winter had begun in Nazi-occupied Holland. Food supplies were completely cut off, and the Dutch population began starving en masse. 15-year-old Audrey watched neighbors collapse and die from malnutrition. She saw children her own age reduced to skeletons, their eyes huge in their shrunken faces. Audrey herself was slowly dying. Her daily ration consisted of a slice of bread made from sawdust, occasionally supplemented with tulip bulbs, grass, and whatever else could be foraged. Her weight dropped to dangerous levels. Her periods stopped. Her hair began falling out. But perhaps most devastatingly, Audrey learned to make herself invisible. In Nazi-occupied territories, being noticed meant danger. Beautiful girls were targets for assault, forced labor, or worse. Audrey survived by disappearing, by making herself smaller, quieter, less noticeable. "I learned to take up no space at all," Audrey would later tell her son Sean. "I learned that if you were small enough, quiet enough, perfect enough, maybe they wouldn't see you. Maybe you could survive." The survival skills that saved Audrey's life during the war became the prison that trapped her during peace. When liberation finally came in 1945, 16-year-old Audrey was severely malnourished, traumatized, and had developed survival mechanisms that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The most devastating was her relationship with food. Food had become the enemy during the war, something desperately needed, but almost never available. Audrey's body and mind had been conditioned to associate eating with guilt, fear, and the knowledge that someone else was probably starving. Even when food became available after liberation, Audrey couldn't overcome the psychological barriers the war had created. She ate like someone who expected the food to disappear at any moment, quickly, secretly, and then felt overwhelming guilt afterward. Or she wouldn't eat at all, as if denying herself was a form of penance for surviving when others hadn't. When Audrey arrived in Hollywood in the early 1950s, her war trauma was mistaken for natural elegance. Audrey's extreme thinness, which was the result of childhood malnutrition and ongoing eating issues, was celebrated as the perfect figure. Her tendency to take up minimal space was interpreted as graceful poise. Her hypervigilance, a classic symptom of trauma, was seen as professional perfectionism. Nobody in Hollywood understood that they were looking at a woman whose entire personality had been shaped by the need to survive genocide. They saw elegance where there was actually anxiety, sophistication where there was actually fear. Most tragically, the industry's celebration of Audrey's look reinforced all of her most destructive behaviors. The thinner she got, the more beautiful everyone said she was. The less she ate, the more photographers loved her angles. The more she disappeared into herself, the more mysterious and enchanting she became. Audrey's success in Roman Holiday was both her triumph and her trap. When Roman Holiday was released in 1953, Audrey became an overnight sensation. She was fresh, charming, and represented a new kind of movie star, not the overtly sexual bombshells like Marilyn Monroe, but something more refined, more innocent, more ladylike. But the pressure to maintain this image was crushing for someone already struggling with perfectionism and self-worth issues. Every photograph had to be perfect. Every public appearance had to be flawless. Every outfit had to reinforce the elegant, sophisticated image that had made her famous. Audrey began working with legendary designer Hubert D. Givenchy, who created increasingly sophisticated, structured clothing that emphasized her tiny waist and slim figure. But maintaining that figure required Audrey to exist on approximately 800 to 1,000 calories per day, well below what any healthy adult woman needs. The cruel irony was that Audrey's beauty was literally built on starvation. Those famous cheekbones were the result of malnutrition. That tiny waist was maintained through restriction that would have killed her if she hadn't been under constant medical supervision. Those huge, expressive eyes seemed so large, partly because her face was so thin. Fashion magazines praised Audrey's discipline and elegance, never understanding that they were celebrating the visible symptoms of trauma and disordered eating. Young women around the world began trying to emulate Audrey's look, not knowing they were trying to replicate the effects of wartime starvation. But Audrey's suffering went far beyond her relationship with food. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive during the war made it impossible for her to truly relax, even in safety. She was constantly scanning for threats, constantly ready to flee, constantly prepared for disaster. This made intimate relationships extremely difficult. Her first marriage to actor Mel Ferrer was troubled from the beginning. Mel was controlling and manipulative, but Audrey's trauma made her mistake his control for protection. She had never learned what healthy love looked like, so she accepted treatment that might have reminded her of the dangerous authority figures from her childhood. When Audrey struggled to have children, likely due in part to the malnutrition she had suffered during her developmental years, she blamed herself with the same merciless perfectionism she applied to everything else. Each miscarriage felt like another failure, another way she was not good enough. The birth of her son Sean in 1960 brought both joy and new terrors. Audrey adored Sean. But her love was tinged with the anxiety of someone who had learned that everything precious could be taken away without warning. She was overprotective to an almost pathological degree, terrified that something would happen to her child. More devastatingly, Audrey projected her own food issues onto Sean's care. She monitored his eating obsessively, alternating between forcing him to eat and restricting his diet when she thought he was getting too heavy. The trauma that had shaped her relationship with food was now affecting her relationship with her child. As Audrey's career continued through the 1960s, her private suffering intensified. Films like Breakfast at Tiffany's, My Fair Lady, and Charade made her one of the most beloved stars in the world. But each role required her to maintain the same impossible standards of perfection. She couldn't gain weight, couldn't age visibly, couldn't show any signs of the psychological struggles that were consuming her. The pressure was particularly intense because Audrey had become more than just an actress. She had become a symbol of elegance and refinement. Women around the world looked to her as an example of how to dress, how to behave, how to be beautiful. The responsibility of being everyone's ideal woman was crushing for someone who had never felt good enough about herself. Audrey's second marriage to Italian psychiatrist Andrea Doty seemed to offer hope for healing. Dr. Doty understood trauma in ways that Mel Ferrer never had. He recognized the signs of what we now call PTSD and tried to help Audrey work through her war experiences. For a brief period in the early 1970s, it seemed like Audrey might finally find peace, but the marriage was complicated by Doty's infidelities and Audrey's inability to trust. Her wartime experiences had taught her that safety was always temporary, that the people you depended on could always betray you. When Doty's affairs became public, Audrey felt the familiar sting of abandonment that had begun with her father's departure decades earlier. The end of her second marriage in 1982 marked the beginning of Audrey's most difficult period. She was 53 years old, dealing with divorce, struggling with her continuing eating issues, and facing the fact that her film career was essentially over. The movie industry had moved on to younger stars, and Audrey's particular brand of elegance was no longer fashionable. For someone whose entire identity had been built around being perfect, being beautiful, and being needed, this rejection felt like a return to the invisibility and worthlessness she had felt as a starving child in Nazi-occupied Holland. But it was also during this period that Audrey found her true calling. In 1988, Audrey was appointed as a Goodwill Ambassador for UNICEF, focusing particularly on helping children in war-torn and poverty-stricken areas. For the first time since her own childhood, Audrey felt like she had found her real purpose. Working with UNICEF allowed Audrey to transform her own trauma into something meaningful. When she held starving children in Somalia, Ethiopia, and Bangladesh, she was holding versions of her younger self. When she advocated for nutritional programs and humanitarian aid, she was fighting for the help that she had needed and hadn't received. "I have a broken heart," Audrey told friends during this period. "But maybe a broken heart can be useful. Maybe it can help me understand what these children are going through." Audrey's final years were marked by both purpose and continuing pain. Her UNICEF work brought her immense satisfaction, but it also exposed her to traumatic situations that triggered memories of her own wartime experiences. Seeing children suffering reminded her of her own suffering, and the weight of that emotional burden was enormous. Physically, Audrey was also struggling with the long-term effects of her eating issues. Her stomach problems, which had begun during the war, had never fully healed. She had developed gastrointestinal issues that would plague her for the rest of her life. When Audrey was diagnosed with abdominal cancer in 1992, Some who knew her best weren't entirely surprised. The stress of maintaining perfection for 40 years, combined with a lifetime of eating disorders and unresolved trauma, had taken a tremendous toll on her body. Some medical professionals who treated her believed that her cancer might have been related to the chronic malnutrition and stress she had endured. Audrey faced her illness with the same grace she had shown throughout her life, but privately, she was terrified. The loss of control, the physical deterioration, the inability to maintain her perfect image, all of these echoed the helplessness she had felt as a child during the war. Audrey Hepburn died on January 20th, 1993. At the age of 63, the world mourned the loss of an icon, celebrating her beauty, her talent, and her humanitarian work. But few truly understood what she had overcome to achieve those accomplishments, or how much she had suffered behind the elegant facade. At her funeral, her son Sean spoke about the mother the world had never seen. She was not the perfect princess everyone thought she was, he said. She was a woman who had survived hell and spent her entire life trying to heal from it. She was brave, but she was also broken. She was beautiful, but she was also in pain. And maybe that's what made her truly beautiful. Not her looks, but her courage to keep going despite the hurt. Today, when we see Audrey Hepburn's image in magazines, on posters, in fashion retrospectives, we should remember what we're really looking at. We're seeing the face of a war survivor who is never able to fully heal from her trauma. We're looking at a woman who is celebrated for characteristics that were actually symptoms of suffering. We're admiring a beauty that was literally built on starvation and maintained through ongoing self-denial. But we're also seeing something else: the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Audrey Hepburn took experiences that could have destroyed her and transformed them into something beautiful. She used her platform to help others who were suffering as she had suffered. She turned her understanding of hunger into advocacy for the hungry. She converted her childhood trauma into adult compassion. Perhaps most importantly, Audrey's story reminds us that perfection is often pain in disguise. The pressure to be the perfect woman nearly killed her. The expectation that she maintain an impossible standard of beauty and behavior trapped her in patterns that perpetuated her trauma. The celebration of her thinness reinforced eating behaviors that were slowly destroying her health. In our Instagram age, when young women are again trying to emulate impossible standards of beauty, Audrey's story is more relevant than ever. Those pictures of her in perfectly tailored Givenchy gowns, looking effortlessly elegant at premieres and parties. She was usually starving herself to fit into those clothes. Those photographs of her looking serene and composed. She was often fighting panic attacks triggered by crowds and loud noises. The real lesson of Audrey Hepburn's life isn't about how to be beautiful. It's about the importance of understanding that beauty and suffering can coexist, that elegance can mask pain, and that the people we idealize are often fighting battles we can't see. It's about recognizing that trauma shapes people in complex ways, and that what we celebrate as positive traits might actually be symptoms of deeper struggles. Most importantly, it's about understanding that true beauty comes not from achieving perfection, but from finding the courage to be authentically human despite our wounds. Audrey Hepburn was beautiful, not because she was perfect, but because she survived. She survived a war that tried to kill her, an industry that tried to control her, and a lifetime of internal struggles that tried to define her. She used that survival to bring beauty into the world, not just through her films and fashion, but through her compassion for others who were suffering, the hunger that never left. Audrey Hepburn wasn't just for food. It was a hunger for safety, for love, for peace, for a world where children didn't have to learn to be invisible to survive. She spent her entire life trying to feed that hunger, not just for herself, but for all the vulnerable children she encountered through her UNICEF work. In the end, perhaps that's the most beautiful thing about Audrey Hepburn. She took her own unfillable emptiness and used it to try to fill the emptiness in others. What do you think? Does learning about Audrey's hidden struggles change how you see her image and legacy? Share your thoughts about the pressure on women to maintain impossible standards, and how we can better support those who might be suffering behind beautiful facades. If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold truths about the Golden Age stars whose pain was hidden behind perfect images. Because understanding the real stories behind our icons helps you better understand ourselves and the pressures we all face. Audrey Hepburn taught us that you can be elegant and traumatized, beautiful and broken, admired and suffering, all at the same time.